Mind. I'm Austin.
I am Duncan.
And Bryce is not with us this week. He was an angry driver. Rest in peace with the government overreach. All right, so this week we are going to be talking about a variety of topics, but our central topic will be the first one we discuss, and I think it will have to be the election in France. The first round of voting has gone through. It's gone with the centrist, Macron, and the far-right candidate, because we're not going to call her conservative by any stretch of the imagination, Le Pen.
Nor is she,
making it through the first round. And something that's fun to note here is that with Macron making it past the first round of voting, it actually affected the U.S. market. It hit record highs just because they felt like he was the best economic choice.
Right, absolutely. And, if we look at that in context, that makes a lot of sense because the other main candidates who were generally thought to have a chance of winning, right now Macron is heavily favored to win the presidency. Le Pen's obviously still in the running, but the chances on her are pretty low. Le Pen was both in favor of pulling France out of the European Union and actually increasing an already incredible amount of government overreach in the French economy. So I think it's fair to say that she would have probably been a much higher recession risk than Macron. And then you also had sort of a late arrival in the form of Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who is so left that even in France's Socialist Party, which for those of you who don't know, France is very, very, very far to the left economically on most issues. Even in France's left-leaning Socialist Party, he considered that party to be too far to the right and left it to run as an independent. So,
well, it sounds like he should be in Venezuela, which that's foreshadowing. That'll be later down the road. All right, so just looking at it like this, people like to call Le Pen the French Donald Trump. Is there any validity to that?
Actually, there is a lot of validity to that. They are very much, I don't want to say that they're related, but they are products of a similar background in the sense that both of them have bought into what Stephen Bannon here in the United States has kind of popularized as economic nationalism, in a sense, an idea of left-wing economics with sort of right-wing foreign and social policies to come up with something that's an unusual hybrid in history. We don't typically see these particular ideas being encompassed within a single political party. But yeah, they are very much in the same vein of political thought. So I think there's a lot of validity to calling her the French Donald Trump in a sense.
And, we get, at least in our circles, I hear a lot about how people are worried, especially in our age group, of another war that could be on a global scale. So when we see all these nationalists get together, it kind of makes me a little, jumpy. And seeing Le Pen take a nationalist, anti-immigrant view, it just kind of reminds you of how World War I and II started.
Right. Although, let's recognize that in this particular instance, we don't quite have the same situation going on where we have this huge interwoven web of treaties between nation states that are running in opposition to each other. Most of the common enemies that the United States, France, the European Union, the rest of NATO have these days aren't actually nation states, but non-national organizations. Think, for example, Hezbollah, Daesh. As a general rule, we don't really have this very complex web of treaties anymore, but it's a legitimate concern nonetheless.
Right, I think it's just the instability in the Middle East, how we've stayed in areas where we're no longer really welcome, even though militarily it seems smart.
And especially when we consider that France has a history of being very active in the Muslim world, not necessarily the Middle East, but in Northern Africa, which used to be controlled by France, especially in Algeria, which is still very closely aligned with France. French military intervention is by no means still considered to be an unusual phenomenon, so I think we do have to take that into account, that she would already be working with a precedent of military intervention in certain circumstances.
You also have to take into account that NATO was pretty much designed to effectively combat Russia's influence, and see that Russia has to run countercurrent to that interest that the U.S. and France are aligned with.
Correct.
The fact that Donald Trump seems to be looking to intervene in at least 3 different countries, that being North Korea, Iran, and what was the other one?
Well, I think you're thinking of Syria.
Wow, how did I forget the biggest one? In the current situation, I should say.
Right.
Wow, I really wish I hadn't forgot that. That's embarrassing. Okay, so when you take all of that into account and how he always kind of bashes China half-heartedly, I should say, even though now he's kind of going back on that when it comes to at least currency manipulation, when it comes to them helping with North Korea problem or whatever. Wow, can you believe that? I can. It's Donald Trump. Anyway, just a concern that I wanted to go over because that's something I hear a lot. But back to France.
So, one other thing that's very interesting to think about is the aftermath of this election, because Macron is he's a completely unique figure in French history, at least in post-war French history, in the sense that he has passed the first round of the electoral process without actually having a political party of any kind. He's a complete independent, which, again, while refreshing, obviously brings up certain political challenges for him if and when he does win the presidency. And especially when we consider last year, François Hollande, who is the current president of France, and who started out, it's interesting, again, France is very leftist economically, but some of its leaders have begun to come to the conclusion that that is actually damaging France's economy. So Hollande actually did try some very limited reforms, especially with the labor laws in France, which effectively preclude businesses from ever downsizing or even firing employees for poor performance, amazingly. But, he tried some very limited reforms, and what he was met with were protests from the French labor unions that in some cases became borderline civil unrest. I mean, we did see quite a lot of violence, destruction of property in France during those protests. So I think it's interesting to think about what Macron, who is himself a moderate, especially economically, would encounter if he tried to do similar things to what Hollande tried to do during the end of his administration.
Certainly, he'd get some backlash. We were talking about how unions have affected, let's say, the U.S. in the 1950s. I'm drawing some parallels there, actually. Yeah. How there was violence. They seemed to bump in with political influence to get what they wanted.
Right, and in France, imagine if that problem had not had any checks on it whatsoever. And France has been, in a certain sense, very leftist for basically the last century. When Karl Marx was still writing in Germany and in Britain, the French were actively reading what he was writing, and in some cases actually putting it into effect at the ballot box, not in the Leninist form of revolution, obviously. But, France is an interesting example.
Hold on. A glorious revolution, comrade.
Let's not go there. But France is an interesting example of what happens when these policies are taken to extremes that they never have been taken to, at least here in the United States. Britain's come a little bit closer during the pre-Thatcher era, but France has just continually kept going in this direction, and now it's sort of in a position where the leaders are going to try to moderate it, I think, over the next several years, and they're going to get a lot of pushback for it, but it's going to be an economic reality that has to occur.
Okay. Well, seeing as it's one of the powerhouses of the EU, Germany is a powerhouse of the EU, and the other powerhouse is leaving the EU, it's going to be interesting to see what happens with the European Union. Right. I've seen some interesting things with Germany, but we'll get to that when they actually have their election. Closing statements for France?
I think in the short term, Macron is the best thing that could possibly have happened to them. Now, with that said, let's not forget how crappy polling has been for the last year and a half. So,
not only that, but France has strange laws about private polling.
Correct.
So I couldn't tell you exactly what it is, but they're not allowed to poll on during certain timelines.
Right, especially right before the election. I believe it's a 48-hour freeze before any election, which is an important period of time because that's when the last people are making up their minds.
Right. So most people.
So let's just recognize that Macron, though he definitely has the best chance, doesn't have this thing in the bag yet. We could still have an upset with Le Pen. Although Hamon, who is the socialist candidate who has lost, and Fillon, who was the conservative, Emmanuel Fillon, have endorsed Macron. So I think he's going to end up getting a coalition vote behind him. But let's not forget that this is still an open vote. Le Pen could, in theory, still win this thing.
Well,
I know that's a disturbing thought.
it is. So, I would like to stop the nationalist trend I see happening around the world. And while I understand it's people promising security through strength in government, it can be a little tempting.
Well,
Well,
and one thing is, let's recognize that the United States and France are a little different in that we are not part of the European Union. I will say that as misguided as nationalism in Europe is, it has a little bit more validity to it because of the moves that the European Union has taken toward federalization, more or less against the will of the individual member states. So there is an action that it is legitimately pushing back against, albeit I would say in a misguided way.
Well, when you say it's misguided, what I'm saying is pushing it back against immigration in particular. Right. It's just, it almost gives, what you're saying is there's a validity to the racism portion of that. What I'm looking at the social implications, not the economic here.
Right.
While I understand the European Union is a reality that I don't have to deal with, thankfully. in a strange way, though, I'm going to go off on a tangent here. So bear with me here. I think the European Union is trying to accomplish what the United States did accomplish. In a certain sense, and I think they're going to have a harder time doing it because the states all have a history of being so vastly different.
Right, and I mean, they're much less homogenous than the colonies were, and we also have to remember that the states originally, and granted this was the case with the 13 original colonies, which got in on the Articles of Confederation and then later ratified the Constitution, but the individual countries of Europe signed an economic trade agreement, and that has since, little by little by little, ballooned into the current semi-federal European Union that we see today. So I think there is a legitimate concern over sovereignty at the national level as opposed to sovereignty at the continental level. That, even a broken clock is right twice a day is I guess what I'm saying here. Right. That they're addressing valid points in supremely non-constructive ways.
Right. I have read some interesting texts that I think we should debate sometime about why, if the European Union consolidated their debt as the states did, it would help their economy. And I think we could have a real debate about the economic implications of that.
We should do that.
Sometime. We have so much on our plate, actually. We have so much in the works.
We have so many projects planned. They're the best projects. You're going to love them. They're going to be fantastic and
the
huge.
Greatest, biggest hands. All right. We're going to go ahead and move on to someone else that likes to talk about how great they are. Let's go ahead and move on to North Korea.
Oh, God.
So, the other big baby has actually threatened Australia, and Chris was the one that wanted to know about this. Shout out to our sound guy, Chris.
The most awesome sound guy in the world, who also composed and performed our intro music.
Not only that, but he's in a band, Slow Motion. Check him out. We'll link him in the description below. He wanted to know what was up with North Korea threatening our homeboys in Australia.
So...
Not his actual words.
But they could be.
They could be.
So, basically, the situation is this. Australia is a major naval force in that part of the world, obviously, just by virtue of geography. Mm-hmm. And they are also a pretty good ally of the United States. Now, granted, right at the start of the Trump administration, there was sort of a gaffe between Trump and Prime Minister Turnbull. Now, as stupid as that was, it didn't really change the fact that the United States and Australia are on very good terms. We're good allies. We have no reason not to be, especially
they've
given
actually
the current
followed
position.
us into a lot of our wars.
Right, and what most people forget is that, like a lot of our allies, World War II was kind of the cohesion there because they fought a gigantic war in the Pacific, largely on our behalf in a lot of cases.
Right, and when you talk to their citizens, a lot of them say, we're doing this just in case anything ever happens, the U.S. will have our back.
Yeah, and I mean, Australia, again, formerly part of the British Empire, now part of the British Commonwealth. We share a lot of history. It's just one of those things that we're sort of natural allies in a sense. Mm-hmm. But with that said, they're not a particularly activist ally. They do help us on some naval patrols out in the Pacific. And, up to this point, there's not really been a big issue with that regarding the situation in the South China Sea and the Korean Peninsula. Well, dear old Kim Jong-un, which, as I recently learned, there's a pejorative in China, sorry, tangent, but there's a pejorative among the Chinese population that, and I'm sorry, I don't speak Mandarin well, but it translates as fatty number 3 is what they actually call him. Fatty number 3.
Well, I'm glad their opinion is just as great as ours.
Right. So fatty number 3, he decided to, well, not him personally, but one of the media outlets that is largely controlled by him, basically threatened that if Australia did not cease being an ally of ours, that when they developed missile technology that could hit mainland Australia, they would actually be attacking them.
They are biting off way more than they can chew.
I was going to say, I don't think anyone's really spoiling for a fight with Australia. I mean, my God, the animals there want to kill you.
There's less reason to invade Australia than just about anywhere else in the world.
Right.
Because even if their army can't, their animals will.
The animals or the climate or something is going to kill you.
Mm-hmm. Not only that, it's just, while it is a great place to have in the Pacific, there's just almost, their mainland isn't able to be developed to the point where it'd be useful, really.
Not particularly.
The outback is very hostile to human activity.
But,
and life in general.
Here's the thing that we have to remember. North Korea at this point is playing a game that it's played in the past, which is threaten somebody and wait until the West decides to make reparations, just to basically... It's like giving a toddler a lollipop when it's screaming. Basically, you shut up the noisy little thing, and you hope it goes away for 5 minutes. But at this point, North Korea's bitten off so much more than it can chew.
It's like a 5-year-old that's still trying to do the same thing.
Right.
Except now the parents are getting a little annoyed.
Right. Now, even in its current situation, it doesn't need another enemy. It's got South Korea on its border. The Japanese are extremely wary of their current position. And let's not forget that Japan is a country that, while it is not a nuclear power, can easily enough assemble a nuclear weapon. They do have all the component parts.
They're technologically pretty advanced.
I want to say that their official timeline on that is 2 to 3 months that they would be able to become a functional nuclear power. And I would say that's probably fairly accurate.
I think it's pretty responsible on their part not to just hold one.
I can understand why, although I have to admit...
makes peace talks a little easier with them.
True, although the more that Kim Jong-un, a.k.a. Fatty Number 3, blusters, the more I begin to see the Japanese resistance, the general Japanese populace's resistance to Shinzo Abe's policies of remilitarization decreasing. This is the first time they've really had something seeming like a credible threat for a long time.
They also have been taking steps against Shinzo Abe's demilitarization. They're now assembling a force that can actually be considered a military force.
Right. Well, no, what I'm saying is Shinzo Abe has been pushing for remilitarization. Because remember, Japan largely demilitarized following World War II.
They were actually forced to in their treaty.
Correct. They actually signed a constitution that labels them as a pacifist state. There was American influence there, obviously.
Well, yeah, we helped them rebuild.
Right, and we have provided security for them ever since, especially in the naval arena. With that said, at this point, World War II and the situations that arose out of it are getting on to being a very long time ago. The reality is not the same as it was 70 years ago, and I think that Shinzo Abe and increasingly the Japanese populace are beginning to realize that and beginning to take steps toward remilitarizing. And part of that's not just North Korea, it's also the disputes on these islands with China, which have been so far peaceful, but definitely a problem in the Pacific.
Absolutely. And China's not just having problems with Japan, they're also having problems with the Philippines and basically everyone in the Pacific that isn't China.
Including Vietnam.
Which is odd, honestly.
Yeah, no, honestly, even after that war, I don't think I'd want to take the Vietnamese on. They're tough.
Yeah, well, I honestly think Well, I have my own thoughts on the everlasting war in America, but
Yeah.
we'll get back to that on a later date. I'm sure we'll agree that spending so much money on wars is starting to get old.
Correct. And one thing that we haven't hit yet, real quick, before we move on, North Korea did actually just recently roll out what appeared to be casings for its first ICBMs in a military parade in honor of Kim Il Sung's birthday.
There we go.
And they did roll out a few new pieces of military technology.
Well, hold on. They definitely rolled out the casings for these things.
As-
However,
As far as anyone can tell, they were not functional. There were some other things. There were some land-based missiles that did appear to be functional pieces. They rolled out some new torpedo or new submarine-based missiles that, frankly, I mean, on their old diesel subs, not really all that useful. About the most useful thing that they rolled out during that military parade were actually the big military transport vehicles that appeared to have been made in North Korea. We have to remember North Korea only has about 500 miles of paved road in it, so they have a hard time moving weapon systems around. Apparently they fixed that problem.
at the very least, I guess.
At some point they're also going to invent fire.
Oh, don't hold your breath. All right. So now that we've made fun of fatty number 3 enough,
Yes.
we're going to cause World War III, Duncan, you and I.
Awesome.
All right, we're going to move on to topic number 3, and it's kind of our love child here. We talk about it so often, most people just don't get as excited as we do when we bring up Venezuela. But we're going to talk about the riots that are happening down there and the touches of communism, because Duncan
Yeah.
loves to talk about riots and communism.
Yeah, so as we actually did report in a recent podcast episode, what basically happened was President Maduro, using the Venezuelan Supreme Court, did try to rob legislative authority from the country's legislature. That was later overturned, largely because of street protests. Now, those protests never actually subsided, so protests have been going on in Caracas for about nearly 2 weeks now. So it's been consistently fairly peaceful, but they've been slowly escalating. So
There were 13 deaths this weekend, if I read right.
about 20, I think, is now the
Okay, I
is
read
now the
early
count.
Sunday.
Yeah, so I think that 20 is now the final count on that.
Jeez.
So far, the military hasn't been predominantly using live ammunition. They've been using rubber bullets, tear gas, but these are getting to the point that protests sometimes do, especially in third world countries, where there's going to be a breaking point. And I mean, I think we can remember that very well with Hosni Mubarak in the Tahrir Square protests back at the very start of the Arab Spring revolutions.
Okay,
And this is kind of a similar situation.
right. It's just there's a lot of civil unrest. It was the decision that made them move. Even if he backtracked on that, they now know that he's willing to do that in their
Correct.
minds.
Correct. Not to mention, you know, it was sort of the candle to, or I mean, the spark to the powder keg, if you will. The issue that ultimately is plaguing Venezuela is the fact that there is no money. I mean, there's no food. You can go to a state-paid doctor. That doctor has no equipment. He has no ability to prescribe you medicine because there is no medicine. This country is in an insane level of poverty thanks to the socialist programs that have been employed within it.
Okay, let me backtrack on that a little bit. They're not just socialists; they're borderline communists.
They are very close to being... In fact, by the standard definition of communism, which is the major means of production being owned and operated by the state, they are soft communists.
Yeah, they're definitely entering that, which is it kind of brings me on to the reason I wanted to talk about it. In a sense, they seized the General Motors plant,
Correct.
which is kind of a big deal.
Now, here's the thing. From General Motors' standpoint, I see some benefit to this. To tell you the truth.
I know, it's funny that you see them getting robbed as a benefit to them.
Well, now here's the reality. This plant had not actually produced a car in 2 or 3 years. It was being used exclusively for spare parts, and thanks to Venezuelan law, which precludes employers from ever downsizing or ever laying anybody off, including for poor performance or simply not showing up to work, 2,700 people were employed in this plant, basically just to say that they were employed. It was costing General Motors a ridiculous amount of money. Now, the one thing that's a really big issue here is the equipment in the plant, which obviously was worth an insane amount of money. General Motors probably isn't going to get that back. And it's unfortunate, but I mean, it's illustrative to me that the conditions economically in that country are so bad, thanks to the laws that are in place there, that it's almost beneficial for businesses not to exist because of the amount of money they lose.
Mm-hmm. You just kind of have to wonder what's going through. That can't be good for our relations with Venezuela because General Motors has made their home here in America.
Right. Not that our relationship with Venezuela is particularly great to start with.
Thanks to the Truman Doctrine, just the instability in South American governments to begin with.
Well, there is that, but there's also the fact that they were, for the very long period of time, backing the FARC rebels in Colombia. Colombia being a much closer ally of ours.
Nowadays.
Yeah, these days at least. One thing that's really interesting to note here, and again, this is why I drew the parallel to the Tahrir Square deal, is Maduro is now passing out advanced weaponry to civilian militias. And this tells you one of two things. Either one, the military can't be trusted, which is probably the more reasonable of the two, that he thinks that the military is priming for a coup against him, which is usually something that would happen in this kind of circumstance, or he simply can't pay the military anymore, which in Venezuela I suppose, still believe. But this introduces a degree of volatility into the protest situations that is borderline insane, because, I mean, what we have to consider is even in the worst military in the world, there is still a degree of discipline that's introduced, if nothing else, by the hierarchical system. Mm-hmm. And when you simply give weapons to a bunch of civilians and tell them to go out and keep peace in high-tension situations for which they have never trained a day in their lives and may not even have trained on these weapons and be proficient in using them, I think you introduce volatility into this situation that could very easily spark off a violent occurrence in the Caracas protests.
Absolutely. So it's going to be interesting. We're going to keep updating you on this just because, honestly, it's our pet project, if nothing else.
We love Venezuela.
In odd ways.
I just want to state for the record, Venezuela, when you overthrow Maduro, if you want me to be your president, I will come down there. You just have to buy my plane ticket.
They couldn't afford it, Duncan.
I know.
Okay. Enough with the jokes. Let's go ahead and move on to the other topic that our sound guy, Chris, of the band Slow Motion, wants to know. He was talking about Donald Trump and wondering why he was so crazy. Not his exact words, but it's what I basically translated. So let's talk about the wall. And this is something that we've talked about at length before. However, it's something that I think needs to be reaffirmed. There was nuance in what he promised with the payment plan that a lot of pundits got wrong, and I'm sure Duncan would love to tell you.
Yeah. Now, I'm not going to say that from the beginning of his campaign, Donald Trump was clearly saying what the payment plan was for the wall, because if you remember, at his campaign announcement in Trump Tower in New York, he did actually bring up the wall. He brought up the whole Mexico paying for it. It was actually the first big controversy of his campaign. But as of the fall, in September getting into October, the press releases, the written plans that he was releasing, all did clearly state that Mexico, the intent at least, was to have Mexico pay us back for a budget expenditure to build the wall. And the implication was heavily that it would be after the project was completed. Now, I can understand where people got confused if they were watching his rallies, that sort of thing, just the average Trump voter, because he never actually said, we're going to build a wall, pay for it, and have Mexico pay us back. He said Mexico's going to pay for it. But the hardcore political pundits, the journalists, they really should have probably done better research, because this didn't really blow up until about the time of his inauguration, when everyone started realizing, hey, that's not what he's actually been saying all along.
Yeah, it's kind of like when Britain voted on Brexit. 2 hours after the vote, the most common thing on Google was, what does that mean?
Yeah.
It's just kind of like that. It's like voter's remorse.
Sure.
Anyway, it's just interesting to see him still push such an unpopular piece piece of
Right.
legislation.
And unpopular among his own party, even, because the thing is, plenty of Republicans are for increased border security, but the consensus across the left, the right, the independent sector, the private sector that's done actual studies into building a border security system that is both effective and in any way cost efficient is that a wall is literally the dumbest thing short of just spanning a piece of string across a bunch of fence posts that you could possibly do.
And, it's just, I understand it was one of his hardcore whatever promises. Sure. He's backtracked on so many at this point, it doesn't even matter.
I will say, this one is a little different because of the objectivity of it, because in 2020, if Donald Trump decides to run for re-election, no one's really going to bother to look up, is there a 35% tariff on Mexico? Has China been formally labeled as a currency manipulator by the United States Treasury Department, etc., etc.? Those are things that are a little harder to discern objectively. However, the presence or lack thereof of a 30-foot wall across the United States land border with Mexico is a little bit easier to determine. You can look at it and say, is it there or is it not?
Right. You know what? And this is going to sound harsh. At this point in our lives, I think the best thing that could happen is the line of succession puts Mattis in charge of the United States.
I will concur.
At least someone in that would understand the geopolitical situations America is in. He's completely reasonable. I just want to say, Mattis 2020, please save us. Run independent. I'll vote for you.
Jim, run, please.
And, that's something I think, even if I really just don't want to talk about the wall, it's such an idiotic idea. I don't even want to think of that being a reality. I just want to briefly describe that there is no circumstance short of Donald Trump changing just about everything he's doing lately that I will vote for Donald Trump. That being said, just like this election, there's no guarantee that I'm going to vote for the other main contender from the Democratic Party. I would like to see someone with reasonable ideas, our Macron, if you will, come out from the woodwork and say, I want sanity.
I'll tell you, at this point, I'm worried it's going to be either Elizabeth Warren or Keith Ellison becoming the Democratic.
Let's be honest, it's going to be Warren. At this point, I think it's crystal clear to me,
Guys,
at least.
You can't see our faces. The following silence is me taking a long drink of beer.
Gotta leave that silence in there. Make it satisfied. Yeah, there we go.
That was
good.
good.
Completed this. Okay.
So, real quick, though, let's bring up why we're actually talking about the wall. Because, basically...
the realization set in the American populace. That's what it comes down to.
Well, there's also the budget. Now, the May 1st budget deadline is coming up, and Trump is, in a sense, trying to secure a shutdown of the government for any budget proposal that does not actually include the wall being funded, which, let's not forget that one of the first things he did as president was sign an executive order ordering the wall to be built. However, he could not actually do that because the funding did not exist.
Exactly. So it's going to be interesting to see, because I doubt the Republican Party is going to get behind that. However, I will say last year they did shut down the government. So their record on that is kind of crappy.
I don't think that enough Republicans are behind the wall specifically. If it was, border security measures to be researched by the private sector and to be done in accordance with whatever was most efficient, I think you could probably get it through. The wall specifically is such a demonstrably poor idea that I think the Republican Party is going to be... I think they're going to be very hesitant to shut down the government over it. And frankly, I think he'll find a few Republicans who are willing to do that. I don't think he's going to find enough of them to actually do it.
It's going to be interesting.
Not unlike the health care bill.
We're going to go ahead and throw some more shade at him later. What else were we going to talk about with Trump? Chris, you remember? It must not have been too significant. I didn't write it down.
Oh.
Let me think here. Nope, not coming back to me in a timely manner. So I honestly, I'm going to leave this at this. I honestly think that we're talking about the craziest portions of the world. Please don't let our podcast make you think that death and despair are awaiting you.
Although, on the other hand, we would like to inform you that our podcast has picked up a new sponsor, On the Mind, brought to you by Xanax, the happy pill for all occasions. Depressed by politics? Please buy Xanax. Available at your local prescription drugstore.
All right, just for the record, we're going to cut that. We're going to cut that real quick.
Fuck.
All right. Not unless we're actually getting paid by Xanax, the happy pill for the populace. All right. So, closing statements. I started mine already. But I'd really like to see our main countries that we're talking about here, except North Korea, because let's face it, without drastic changes to their entire government, nothing's going to change there. I'd like to see Venezuela figure out that, hey, this isn't working. I'd like to see France say, hey, we shouldn't be too crazy. And I'd like to see Donald Trump just cease to be president. But I guess I can wait a few years for that.
Right.
Anyway.
So, my closing statement here, I'm just going to say on France, I think they've made an informed decision in choosing Macron over Mélenchon, and I'm hoping that they will make an informed decision in choosing Macron over Le Pen. I think he's going to be substantially better for the French economy than any other legitimate contender. In Venezuela, I don't think that there's quite as much optimism to be had. I would argue that Venezuela is so structurally damaged that either its entire government will have to be ousted, or at least that government will have to remove Nicolas Maduro and completely change the structure of the economy through privatization, through opening the market, especially to Colombia. I don't think that Venezuela can even continue on for more than a few months like this. I think we're at the end of Venezuela as a socialist republic. Maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe I'm calling it a little too early, but that's just my opinion. On Trump, at least the other two issues mattered. I mean, the wall is probably not going to happen. There's probably not going to be funding for it. Even if there is funding for it, it's probably going to be a logistical impossibility with acquiring the land. I don't see any way that in 2020 there is a 30-foot border wall across the southern border of the United States. And I don't see how even Donald Trump, with his supreme marketing skills, is going to be able to claim that he did anything on that front.
Just a quick reminder, Duncan, we'd also talked about North Korea.
I know, but I just didn't have anything to say about it.
Fair enough. Well, that's all that's on the Might in this week. If you liked the video, please like, comment, subscribe. Let us know how you're feeling. Let us know, like Chris does, that despair greets him every time he thinks about politics. Just let us know. We would like to talk to you. Yeah. If not, we've got links to other videos. Yeah. And anything else, Duncan? And
tell us what you want to see us do, because we'll talk about literally anything. We are desperate for your approval, and we will do anything to get it.
Think of us as teenage girls.
Yes.
So, that's all that's on the mind. Thanks for watching.
Good night.